Hello, everybody. My name is Mariruth, and you can tell by my outfit that Christmas is just around the corner. Today, I will talk about complex sentences. A complex sentence is like two bells and a ribbon. The bells represent an independent clause plus a dependent clause, which are joined by a subordinator. In this video, we will be focusing on noun clauses which behave like a noun and relative clauses which post-modify an antecedent. These clauses are introduced by subordinators like relative adverbs and relative pronouns. In the case of noun clauses, the subordinating conjunction that can also introduce the clause. In order to identify and explain noun clauses and relative clauses, it is necessary to find them in context. In this case, we are going to find them in literature. For that reason, I chose a very special book called Frankenstein, in which I will show you examples that are useful for understanding complex sentences. We are going to start with this complex sentence that says, I confess that I felt a few sensations of terror. The first step is to identify the main verb in the sentence, which is confess, and the subject is I. Now, we identify the subordinator that introduces the clause, which is that. So the name of our clause would be that clause. Then, we need to know what type of verb is confess. For this, we need to ask, confess what? That I felt a few sensations of terror. To whom? To no one. That information is not given in the sentence. In this case, our clause is acting as a direct object because it answers the question, what? And the verbs that have a direct object are transitive verbs. So, our context would be after a transitive verb of speaking, because confess implies telling something. Finally, we need to know whether our sentence asks for information, reports something, or states something. This sentence neither asks for information nor reports something that someone else said, so the use would be a statement. In the second example, we will be following the same steps as before. The sentence says, I do not think that the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to this rule. First, we identify the main verb in the sentence, which is think in its negative form, and the subject is I. Second, what introduces the clause? The subordinator that. So this clause is a that clause. Third, let's ask the question. I do not think what? That the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to this rule. To whom? It is impossible to think something to someone. Remember to not confuse it with think of someone. Therefore, the function is direct object. As I explained in the first sentence, transitive verbs require a direct object. So the context of the clause is after a transitive verb of thinking, instead of speaking, because the verb expresses a thought. Finally, is this clause asking, reporting, or stating something? This clause neither reports something nor asks a question, so the use would be a statement. Now let's check this last example about noun clauses. Just like the other ones, we follow the same steps. The sentence says, I need not say that we were strangers to any species of disunion or dispute. First, what is the subject in the sentence? The subject is I. And what is the main verb in the sentence? The main verb is say. Then, what is the subordinator? Again, our subordinator is that. So the type is that clause. What type of verb is say? I need not say what, that we were strangers to any species of disunion or dispute. Does the speaker say this to someone? To whom? No one. So the clause functions as a direct object. Next, what verbs answer the question what? Exactly, transitive verbs. So our clause is after a transitive verb of speaking. And finally, the use would be statement, because the clause is not asking any question nor is reporting something. The second part of this video is about relative clauses. Let's remember that relative clauses post-modify an antecedent which can be a noun or a pronoun. This means that relative clauses give essential or extra information about the antecedent. Let's check this example. This sound disturbed an old woman who was sleeping in a chair beside me. Before we start, it is important to know that relative clauses can post-modify an antecedent in the subject or in the predicate. Let's first identify the independent clause and the dependent clause. The independent clause in this case is this sound disturbed an old woman. Second, remember that the dependent clause is after a noun or a pronoun. In this case, the subordinator who introduces the relative clause. Who was sleeping in a chair beside me. Now that we have done that, is the relative clause giving essential information? We can tell that if we look at the clause. In this case, the clause is giving essential information because it is not between commas. This type of relative clause is called defining relative clause. Now, what is the function of the subordinator in the clause? In this case, who is acting as a subject of the clause because it is replacing the noun woman and it cannot be omitted. Now, let's read the second example. You will find a happy, cheerful home and friends who love you dearly. Let's identify the independent clause and the dependent clause. The independent clause in this sentence is, you will find a happy, cheerful home and friends. Second, let's find the relative clause after a noun or a pronoun. In the clause, the subordinator who introduces our relative clause, who love you dearly. Third, is the relative clause giving essential information? Let's look at the dependent clause. In this case, the clause is giving essential information because it is not between commas. So this clause would be a defining relative clause. Now, what is the function of the subordinator in the clause? Who is acting as a subject of the clause because it is replacing the noun friends and it cannot be omitted. Let's read the next sentence. This was the commencement of a nervous fever which confined me for several months. First, the independent clause is this was the commencement of a nervous fever. Second, in the dependent clause, the subordinator which introduces the relative clause, which confined me for several months. Then, let's look at the dependent clause. This is given essential information because it is not between commas, so this clause would be a defining relative clause. Finally, the subordinator which is acting as a subject because it is replacing the antecedent, which is fever, and it cannot be omitted. Now let's check the final example. My departure for Ingolstadt, which had been deferred by these events, was now again determined upon. In this sentence, our dependent clause introduced by the subordinator which is part of the subject in the sentence. In contrast to the other exercises, this relative clause, which had been deferred by these events, is between commas, which means that it's not given essential information and it would be non-defining. Which is acting as the subject of our clause because it replaces antecedent and it cannot be omitted. Unlike the other exercises, the subordinator which is not immediately preceded by the antecedent. Here, the relative clause is given extra information about the departure, not the place Ingolstadt, because the extra information would not have made any sense and the subordinator would have been a relative adverb. Unfortunately, this is the end of this video. I would like to thank the one and only Mary Shelley from Beyond for writing such an amazing and helpful story for this video. And I would like to thank you, dear viewer, for watching this video.